I feel so uncomfortable, I said. Oh, so do I, Tad quickly agreed. I feel as if I'm cheating on you. The Emma who usually lives here is the greatest woman I've ever known. But let's just say I haven't had a figure like yours in my bed for more than 20 years. I think I'm coveting my own wife. Oh, God. Jesus, Chad. Welcome to WordWise. I'm Kit, and today we'll be going through Chad Daybell's third novel, Escape to Zion. Chad's first novel is fairly lighthearted, and his second isn't too heavy, given that half of it takes place during World War II. Escape to Zion keeps that lighthearted feel, but against a background of Chad's idea of hell on earth. It's in this novel that we really start to see how Chad characterizes good and evil, and I don't think it will surprise you to learn that his ideas about these concepts aren't normal. Also, I want to mention quickly that I caught a virus at a stamp show, and it triggered an asthma flare that I'm still getting under control, so please pardon my coughing and gravelly voice. I may have to record this in 2 sessions, partly because it's likely to be my longest video on Chad's work. This book is just a lot. Let's begin with the introduction, or as Chad puts it, author's introduction. A heading I've never seen before, and from here on out, all of his books will begin with a page or 2 of notes from him. He uses this introduction to explain why, since the novel takes place in the future, he couldn't rip the plot off from the lives of his ancestors like he did with his first 2 novels, so he had to rip it off from other people and their writing, and he lists several sources, all of which I've read. Then he makes this rather astonishing statement. I have avoided mentioning specific dates within the novel, but for the sake of the story, the reader will sense that Emma has journeyed about 3 decades into the future. This time frame was based more on coordinating the ages of the characters in the story, rather than an attempt to pinpoint the time of the Second Coming. Besides, if someone reads a copy of this novel 10 years from now, the reader will still feel the story is taking place 30 years in the future. To which I say, huh? As a writer, I don't know how I would write something that perpetually feels like it's taking place 10 years in the future. Before we dive into the story, quick refresher. These books center on Emma Dalton, a young Mormon woman whose family carries some kind of genetic variant that causes them to travel through time if they hit their heads too hard. Emma's brother Doug has also traveled through time this way. Emma has recently married a guy named Tad. Now, on to chapter 1. As you may recall, a couple of chapters before the end of Doug's dilemma, Emma was in a car accident. She knocked her noggin on the window sufficiently hard to send her into the future. The first chapter opens with a classic Chad trope, a character managing to say something even though they don't have nearly enough time in which to say it. In this case, Emma's husband Tad apparently sees the other car approaching and shouts, "Oh no! Emma, watch out!" right before they get hit. Emma wakes up in the middle of an intersection in Salt Lake City and is nearly mowed down by 2 horses hauling chariots. I sat up as a large, green-haired woman with pierced lips reached me. She roughly grabbed my elbow and yanked me to the side of the street as 2 chariots rushed past us. This book demonstrates, maybe more than any of his other books, how certain Chad is that good people are conventionally attractive, clean, modestly dressed, and have no tattoos or piercings, and evil people are overweight, scantily clad, and well-decorated. Disoriented, Emma asks where her husband is. The woman frowned. "You're married? How old-fashioned." I want to point out that this book was published in 2000. That means the future, in this case, is 2030. As I record this, the year is 2024. Chad believed, back in 2000, that by 2030, marriage would be considered old-fashioned. So here's your warning. If you ever want to get married, you'd better do it quickly, because within the next 6 years, this institution that we have evidence of dating back 4,000 years is going to fall completely out of fashion. Chad's belief that things must look pretty to be good and vice versa applies to places too. I had never seen Salt Lake in such an ugly condition. Weeds and garbage were everywhere, and the streets were filled with deep potholes. The entire sky was a hazy gray, and the citizens were downright scary. Unfortunately, my clean appearance stood out, and several people were staring curiously at me. Emma's nice clothing immediately inspires a man to try to rob her of her clothing. My kicking had hindered the man's progress, but he'd somehow unlatched the top button of my jeans. I mostly just read that because I think unlatching a button is excruciating. I realized Trad was trying to avoid saying unbuttoned my button, but that's the only verb that really makes sense here. Language isn't perfect. Sometimes our only options are awkward, but they're still better than unlatching a button. It takes Emma more than a page to realize she's traveled through time again, which is pretty funny given that this is her second time traveling, and it only took her 3 paragraphs her first time. I would have expected her to be a little bit quicker on the uptake this time, but she finally figures it out. Everything pointed to the fact I'd somehow been bumped into the future, but not too far. Very few new buildings had been added to the skyline. The tallest buildings were badly damaged, with shattered windows and crumbling walls. It depressed me to see how far civilization had slipped. I'd always imagined a future of flying cars and wonderful high-tech gadgets, but Salt Lake was now little more than a ghetto filled with unpleasant people. I couldn't understand it. Where were all the Latter-day Saints? Emma walks to Temple Square because she figures she can get some help at the temple, but she finds it encircled by a 10-foot-high fence. A sign read, "Danger, high voltage. This fence is energized." Literally 2 paragraphs later, Emma puts her hands on the fence. Her electrocution attracts the attention of the guards, and wouldn't you know it, one of them happens to be Don Fowers, because, as with most problems in Chad's books, God just fixes things. You might remember Don as the young man who went on the terrible cave date with Connie and May and Doug at the beginning of Doug's Dilemma. He lets Emma into Temple Square. Don isn't surprised that Emma is young, because right after our missions, Doug told me about your adventure in 1868, and then he shared with me his stint with your great-grandpa in World War II. He then explained you'd then been sent on another errand, likely in the future. It sounded unbelievable to me, but I'd never known either of you to be dishonest. Besides, you were missing once again, so the story sounded plausible. In what way did this story sound plausible? If a friend's sister goes missing and then reappears, and then goes missing again several years later, I'm thinking addiction, mental illness, maybe a secret relationship. I'm not thinking time travel. And if my friend tells me it's time travel, I'm thinking the mental illness is hereditary. But one of the strange things Chad seems to believe, or I'm assuming he believes it because we see it happen over and over again, is that good people can instantly recognize truth when they hear it. We saw it happen repeatedly during Doug's mission. He would introduce someone to the Book of Mormon, and they would say, "I know it's true," an hour after hearing the gospel for the first time. No one ever considers anything, or contemplates it, or does research. They just know. And Don apparently knew. I love how casual Emma's response is. "Yes, these time-traveling errands are the real deal," I said. The next 50 pages or so are chock full of overlapping, sometimes conflicting, always confusing explanations of what happened during the last 30 years, some of which I'll discuss, but most of which I'll skip. Here, Don explains that after World War III began, the professional sports system collapsed. But after the war, the guys who had operated professional wrestling filled the void by creating a brutal game called Conquest, an actual battle using swords and spears. It was essentially legalized murder. This is the beginning of the theme, and the theme is, if society's rules weaken just a little bit, all non-Mormons will instantly become evil. And not a little evil, full-blown evil. Apparently we're all just waiting for a tiny crack in the system so that hell can break loose. Literally. Later in this scene, Don tells Emma that 89% of the country watched a particularly important conquest match on TV. Chad thinks that 89% of the country would tune in to see a team gladiator fight to the death. He honestly seems to believe that most Americans crave violent bloodshed. And that's not the only vice we're ready to take up at the drop of a hat. I'm gonna have to watch my language here. The people had forgotten God. The people who survived the war quickly became obsessed with vulgarity and corn. People were so desensitized that conquest actually seemed like family entertainment. TV became nothing but horrible shows promoting every sin imaginable. As an aside, what do you think of calling these words we have to use to please the YouTube algorithm euphemisms? Is it too cute? Back to the story. I shook my head in sadness. I'm not surprised society ended up in the gutter. It was heading in that direction at the turn of the century. Now, I suppose to Chad, who believes that the total collapse of civilization is just one skin flick away, maybe the world did seem like it was headed for the gutter back in the year 2000. As becomes clear, he's certain that litter, revealing clothing, and violent sports are the handiwork of Satan. But I can't help noticing that human suffering doesn't seem to register with him at all. I mean, let's say the year 2000 was a time when society was spiraling. Was it spiraling because of all those baby doll tops with the spaghetti straps? Or was it spiraling because of poverty and out-of-control medical costs and food insecurity? Why is Chad so focused on appearances and so indifferent to actual pain? I still haven't figured that out. Thus ends chapter 2. Don informs Emma that the second coming of Jesus Christ is only a few months away. He knows this because certain prophecies have been or are in the process of being fulfilled. A city called New Jerusalem has been built, and 2 apostles from the quorum of the 12 apostles are in the Old Jerusalem, using the power of the priesthood to prevent a giant army from destroying Israel. This requires some explanation. According to the LDS Church's website, priesthood has 2 meanings. First, it's the power and authority of God, and second, it's the power and authority God gives people to act on his behalf. Take that back. Not people, just men. Women can't have it, because, we might get PMS and just start handing out blessings willy-nilly. The 2 apostles are in Jerusalem using the power of the priesthood to protect Israel from people trying to destroy it. Don says, those 2 have been in Jerusalem for just over 3 years, preaching the gospel and basically saving Israel from destruction through the use of the priesthood, Don said. Without their intervention in behalf of the Lord, those northern countries would have crushed Israel to dust by now. Like, Lithuania? Norway? No, but seriously, I looked this up and it's someplace called Magog. I read a number of theories on what the modern day equivalent to Magog might be, but nobody actually knows. And most people seem to pick Russia just because it's due north of Israel. Interestingly, Chad decides to put a racist spin on things and specifies that the army of Magog is Arab. I don't really know why we needed that. Emma desperately wants to know the name of these 2 apostles. But Don, who is a terrible date, but apparently the only smart person in these books, refuses to tell her because he knows that if she ever bumped into them in the past, she'd tell them they were going to die. Emma insists, "Oh, I'd never say anything." Honey, do you know how many times you blurted out time travel secrets? You told Finity and Mary when they would die, the names of their descendants for 6 generations. You told them about tractors and cars and the moon landing, I think, but you'd never say anything. Emma is going to go on to blurt out secrets about the future in this book. Don is the only one who's got her number. He knows that the real Dalton family curse is the inability to shut up about time travel. Now, to switch gears mid-scene, we get a very interesting little true crime note. Regarding these apostles, Don says, "The Lord has given them power to control the elements, so they're doing just fine." Now, those of you who listened to the trial, Laurie's trial, might know that Chad told Zulema Pastenes, who was a member of their little in-group, that she had the ability to control the elements. Obviously, this isn't an original idea, it's straight out of Revelations. But it's interesting to me that Chad was attempting to bestow these kinds of end-time powers on his followers. Since we're already on the subject of Chad's depravity, I want to read the rest of this paragraph. My favorite tactic they've used so far is when they sent hurricane-force winds against a huge squadron of enemy aircraft. The wind and the planes met right over the Sea of Galilee, and within minutes there were dozens of expensive planes plunging straight into the water. Today's tornado was pretty impressive, though. My favorite tactic. Does anyone else think that's an incredibly weird thing to say? Not the phrase itself, but the statement that seeing dozens of planes full of living people plunge into the sea warrants a place as a favorite anything. And then the statement about the tornado suggesting it wasn't as cool as the hurricane. He's talking about a tornado that killed 250,000 people. He's describing the destruction as entertainment. And yet 3 pages ago, he was condemning violence as entertainment. Talk about projection. Don takes Emma up to the roof and shows her all the parts of the city and the countryside that have changed. I know Chad wrote these books for an exclusively LDS audience, but not all Mormons live in Salt Lake City. He wrote this entire book just assuming that his readers knew Salt Lake and Provo and Springville and Jackson, Missouri, and even Brigham Young University's campus. In another story, it might not matter so much, but in this one, it actually does because they spend so much time traveling. I'd never heard of Manti, Utah before I began reading these books. And why would I have? It has a population of 3,200 people. No disrespect to Manti, it sounds cute. My point is, don't assume your readers share your geographic knowledge. Anyway, I'm going to skip a lot of this because it's just not important. The gist is that there have been a lot of environmental disasters in the last 30 years. The Great Salt Lake is down 80% due to lack of rain. Salt Lake City has endured a number of earthquakes. There's a timeline in here that doesn't make a whole lot of sense and is completely contradicted in Chad's later books. Because don't worry, he wrote 5 more books about the Daltons and their friends. But the basic timeline seems to be that World War III was followed by riots and civil disputes, and then the LDS prophet called for the people to build New Jerusalem, and then the natural disasters occurred. Maybe. I was pretty confused. Don also warns Emma about a guy named Larry who goes by the name Sherem. Sherem is a figure from the Book of Mormon. He's essentially a false prophet. This Sherem has taken over the Capitol building, which I would say is Chad's attempt at symbolism, except he barely says anything about the government anywhere in this trilogy. It's rarely mentioned in the other books in this series either, like to the point where it's weird. I think he just doesn't know anything or have any interest in the government. Of course, he's getting a crash course in the judicial branch these days. Sherem is running some kind of offshoot Mormon church. Of course, his teachings also condemn marriage and sexual abstinence. Anyone looking for free love can find it in Sherem's church. Chad really hates hippies. Thus ends Chapter 3. Chapter 5 begins with Emma leafing through Don's collection of old newspapers that he's going to use to make a scrapbook. The 3rd paragraph isn't even written in sentences, it's literally just a list of things that happened in the 30 years since Emma's car accident. Oh, wait, here's the government. The collapse of the federal government. Washington, D.C. abandoned. Well, that answers all my questions. Immediately after this paragraph listing the horror of the end times, he writes an even longer paragraph about nudist colonies. The most entertaining article, though, described several nudist colonies that had sprouted up on the shores of Lake Powell. The Glen Canyon Dam had survived the earthquakes, although it no longer produced electricity, and Lake Powell had become a popular spot for naturalists who survived mainly on fish. I winced at the carefully edited pictures of some badly sunburned people who really should have put on a swimsuit. Alright, another dig at hippies. But what does it mean that Chad thinks this paragraph belongs immediately after a paragraph describing hurricanes and civil wars? Obviously, it indicates that he doesn't understand tone well enough to realize you can't just switch the entire tone of a piece of writing on a dime like this. But I think it also says something about him. There's a callousness to putting these paragraphs one after another. And then, just to make it worse, he switches back. On a more somber note, one amazing front-page photo showed New York City completely engulfed in flames. The Twin Towers' blackened shells rose above the inferno. I'm rarely offended, but this offended me. Chad claimed in his autobiography to have predicted 9/11. I remember 9/11. I was in college and I watched TV all day. We all did. We all saw a lot of terrible, traumatizing images. But what we didn't see was New York completely engulfed in flames. Nor did we see the Twin Towers' blackened shells. Because those things didn't happen. Chad didn't predict 9/11. The fact that he would try to co-opt an event like this to bolster his image as a psychic is, as Callum Markey would say, grim. And the worst part is his description of how this affected him. This is from his autobiography. As I worked on Escape to Zion in 2000, I kept having a dream that the Twin Towers in New York City were burning. In the dreams, I was always on the street below the towers. They were both on fire and people were running and screaming. I didn't know the cause. From my vantage point, it seemed like all of Manhattan was on fire. This dream had deep personal significance since I served my entire mission in New Jersey along the Hudson River. The Twin Towers were like a central beacon to me. I decided to include portions of the dream in Escape to Zion. In the book, the main character, Emma, is in the future, and she reads an old newspaper about the Twin Towers being burned. So it kind of threw me for a loop when it actually happened a year later. What kind of casual chuckle is this? Can you imagine what it would be like if this had actually happened? If you had dreams about 9/11 and then it happened? Can you imagine how terrified and sick you'd feel? How scared to go to bed you'd be? For someone who was long obsessed with the Twin Towers, Chad shows them and the victims of that tragedy no reverence. The next day, Emma is able to hop on a train that the LDS Church owns and operates. They have some sort of central farm, and I guess they use the train to deliver fruits and vegetables to different temples because some Mormons stayed behind instead of going to New Jerusalem so they can guard the temples. So the train bops around bringing them vegetables. The guy operating the train is very confused when Emma keeps asking him all of these questions about the places they're passing. And for once, she doesn't blurt out that she's a time traveler. Maybe she's practicing keeping that to herself. Anyway, the guy warns her away from an area called Lincoln Point that he says is the evilest place in the valley. Thus ends chapter 5. The train drops Emma off in Springville on the way to Manti, but it will come back around in about 3 hours in case she's ready to leave. She's going to Springville to look for her parents because she doesn't know what else to do. She's upset to see that the LDS chapel she used to attend is now a Church of Sharam. Thus ends the unnecessarily brief chapter 6. When she gets to her parents' house, she finds her brother's car on blocks in the front yard. I was certain my family was gone when I spotted 2 shirtless, filthy men sitting on my mother's porch, taking turns drinking brown liquid out of a mason jar. The men were laughing and cracking crude jokes. Not crude jokes. And they were cracking them? Sorry. Emma's parents have carved a message into a tree for her. The same tree that she was supposed to bury that box under in the last book. The message says to go to the Provo Temple. But before she can leave, the 2 men decide to assault her. She climbs up on the roof of her brother's car. "What you're trying to do is wrong," I said as calmly as I could, but they just laughed at that. "Nothing's wrong anymore," Barry said. "Haven't you heard the news? It's okay for us to just do what feels good." What are they, philosopher drunks? This is not good dialogue. Shifty guys living in someone else's house and day drinking should not be exhibiting this kind of introspection. At least not in a novel where they're undoubtedly meant to be evil. Emma is still standing on top of the car. Lem suddenly grabbed my ankle, but I shook loose and leaped off the Volkswagen. Lem tried to catch me, but I put my right knee in his chest. We toppled to the ground, and I heard a couple bones crack within him as we hit. Lem groaned, and his eyes rolled back in his head. Did Emma just kill this guy? Lem had dropped his jar of homemade brew during our tussle, and I quickly picked it up and flung the remaining liquid into Barry's face as he came around the car. "My eyes! Oh, they're burning!" he screamed. "Sorry if I hurt you," I said, amazed I had escaped. "I just took your advice and did what felt good." Again, we get this unsettling flip from horror to humor. It's giving me whiplash. Are Chad's emotions shallow, and because of that, he cycles through them quickly? Does he not know that this kind of flippantness is, if nothing else, distasteful? Or is he trying to write an action sequence with like a Marvel movie style quip thrown in? Don't get me wrong, there are stories and scripts where this could have worked. Deadpool is a perfect example. You can have your character crush a guy's chest cavity and then make a joke. But that has to occur as part of a consistent tone throughout. You have to establish early on that your story either has gory violence and ironic humor, or cartoon violence and corny humor. But what you can't do is cram gory violence and corny humor into a story about the second coming of Jesus. Chad has a problem maintaining a consistent tone in his writing. Learn from him. Thus ends chapter 7. Emma flees from the scene of the attempted murder and goes back into town. I heard piano music filtering out of the Center Street church as I passed it again. The song being played was sinister and fast-paced, and it bothered me to hear such music coming from that wonderful building. I left the street and marched through the church's front door, which was now propped open. I entered the chapel and saw a few people sitting in the pews, but several middle-aged couples were dancing lewdly in the aisles and on the stage. It was grotesque. In addition to the Twin Towers and the end of the world, Chad is obsessed with dancing. How a person dances will tell you if someone is good or evil. On the stage, I saw a hefty woman with waist-length hair playing her heart out on the piano. She wore a brightly colored, low-cut dress and a tiara on her head. I guessed she was the leader of this disgusting group. I skirted my way around some gyrating dancers and climbed the steps to the stage. It turns out that the woman playing the piano is Angie. You know, that friend of Emma's who showed up for 3 pages at the beginning of the first book and then never got mentioned again. I know we were all waiting with bated breath for her to come back. Angie has changed her name to Serena. I will call her Angie Serena because the people in the book keep switching back and forth. She's now the high priestess of the Church of Sharon, so it sounds like she's doing all right. But Emma is upset that she's not a Mormon anymore. Angie Serena throws her out, and then Emma is chased through town by Barry, who's upset about Lem's crushed sternum. He's about to catch her when the train pulls back into town an hour and a half early. "I apologize," Jason said. "I should have never left you alone like that. We'd gone up the canyon for a half hour when Ron stopped the train just below the Thistle landslide. He told us he had a strong impression you were in trouble, so he threw the train into reverse and obviously made it back just in time." God has fixed Emma's problems once again. Also, can trains go in reverse? I actually don't know. They probably can. Anyway, thus ends chapter 8. Emma gets off the train at the Provo Temple and finds her parents. Her mother is waiting for her by the door, and she says she knew Emma would be coming because it's written in Emma's second book, the one she's going to write about her second time travel adventure, the one she's currently on. More nothing happens in this chapter, and then my mind was racing as I struggled to piece everything together. So where was I? The middle-aged me. Thus ends chapter 9. Almost the first thing Emma's mother, Michelle, says to her after they've exchanged greetings is, "Emma, aren't you curious about what Doug looks like now?" No, like, what a strange question. Why would she care what Doug looks like? Wouldn't she want to know where he is and what he's been doing and if he has a family? The way Chad set this up, I almost expected the sight of the photo to be the moment Emma realizes Doug is evil now, right? He's gotten fat, his skin is sagging, his hair is gray, and Emma would see the photo and gasp. But no, Doug looks okay. He went bald, but apparently that's not indicative of evil. Mark and Michelle tell Emma that Doug married Becky, the one he met in the last chapter of the second book, and that Doug and Becky had 3 kids, but one died. And Becky died too. Daniel and Becky both died within 6 days of each other, a few months after Grandma's death, Mom said. And then Grandpa Jack died of a heart attack the next month. Whoa, that's a lot of funerals in 1 year, I said. What kind of reaction is this? Whoa, that's a lot of funerals? You just heard that 4 of your family members are dead. Okay, 2 of them you never met. But still, even if Emma weren't related to any of them, this wouldn't be an appropriate response to hearing that someone has lost 4 family members. At no point in the scene does Emma demonstrate any sorrow or any compassion for her parents or for Doug. Emma was honestly more upset when she realized Angie Serena wasn't a Mormon any longer than when she learned her grandparents had died. I put down Doug's family photo and retrieved the other one. It was a shock to my 22-year-old system. It was my family. Tad looked in good shape, although he'd lost some hair too. Then I looked at myself. I looked cheerful, but I was also quite chunky. Am I really this plump? Mom put her arms around me. I knew you wouldn't like this picture, she said. Who cares if you filled out just a little? Emma is horrified that she's going to gain weight in the future. Chad even includes it in her internal dialogue in scenes where it isn't really relevant. It's on her mind the entire rest of this book, and it's going to become its own subplot. Emma finds out that she has 3 children in the future, and then she gets distracted. I pondered for a moment. So where am I now? You mean the older you? Dad asked. I suppose you've disappeared from your home in New Jerusalem, since you can't be in 2 places at the same time. As I mentioned previously, time travel in fiction is an interest of mine. This isn't the first book I've read where 2 versions of the same person can't exist in the same single timeline, but it might be the first where one person time travels and the other version of them just stops existing for a while. And who explained this rule to her father? How does he know this is how it works? Emma's parents give her a copy of the book Doug wrote about his time travel adventure and tell her to read it. Then they dangle a copy of the book that Emma will write about the adventure she's currently on in her face and tell her she can't read it. They should not have told her this book even exists. They must know she has no impulse control. They walked to the door, and I saw Dad holding that 3rd volume. It angered me that Dad wouldn't let me read it, but now I see the wisdom in my parents' decision. Meanwhile, I propped up the pillows on the bed and quickly became absorbed in the dilemma Doug endured in 1944. Again, I say, what dilemma? There was no dilemma in that book. I'm not convinced Chad knows what a dilemma is. Thus ends chapter 10. I never figured out why Emma's parents are so insistent that she read Doug's book. They don't even talk about it afterward. So maybe Emma was right all along and her parents really do just love Doug more. After she reads Doug's book, she falls asleep, and the next morning she happens to have breakfast with Brother Newman, who is the father of Angie Serena, high priestess of the Church of Sharon. Apparently, Angie Serena had a baby when she was 20, and then started dating a guy named Larry, who changed his name to Sharon. He eventually sent Angie Serena to run his Springville church, and her son joined a gang. Just a warning, Sharon never appears in this book. Angie Serena's baby does, though. Emma's mother explains to her that they need her help to find Emma's brother's Doug's 2 kids, Justin and Heather, who are in Lincoln Point, the most evil place in the valley. Justin and Heather are 15 and 13, respectively, and they had been living in the temple, but they ran away. Their mother is dead, and their father Doug is one of the 144,000 who are scouring the earth for faithful Mormons one more time before the second coming, so they can't go get them. They need Emma to do it. Thus ends chapter 11. I was getting very frustrated. I know it's a dangerous place, but can't we just go there and demand they return home? You don't understand, Emma, Dad said. There aren't fences to keep people out of Lincoln Point, but there are 20 ruffians guarding every road to the city who use devious tactics. If you're young and attractive, they treat you like royalty and entice you to join them. But if you look even 25, they'll beat the living heck out of you. And I don't think Heather and Justin understand that once you're in Lincoln Point, their leader doesn't let you leave the city until you're completely brainwashed. That's what I fear most. Chad never explains why the Lincoln Point group hates people over 25, and he never explains why there isn't a single other person under 25 who could go in Emma's place. God doesn't really require much of a reason to send someone through time in these books, does he? Emma isn't too keen on going, but her parents don't care. Isn't there another way to save the kids? I said. Are you saying there aren't any adults there to supervise things? Mom and Dad half smiled, despite the seriousness of the situation. Let's get you packed, Dad said. I'm guessing Emma did not get that all-important lecture on consent when she was growing up. Then Chad spends half a page reminding us how hot Emma is. This is her mother speaking. Take your clothes off. The ones you're wearing are way too nice. The guards would strip you naked within seconds. Mom! Her words shocked me. I haven't showered since I arrived here, I said. I already feel grungy enough. Mom shook her head. The kids at Lincoln Point haven't bathed in years, so don't pout. In fact, we'll need to dirty you up and hide your slender figure from those lunatics. You're much too pretty to go looking like that. They decide Emma should wear the dress she borrowed from Mary in the past, the one we heard about back in the first book, that she never returned because she hit her head again and traveled to present time. But she's going to wear it over her clothing. I can't offer any explanation for that. Much of Chapter 12 and all of Chapter 13 are spent with Mark and Michelle giving Emma a rundown of what happened during and after World War III. They claim that a lot of Mormons left the church because they didn't want to live according to the law of consecration. This was a revelation Joseph Smith had that all of the LDS church's members should give everything they had to the church, and it would dole things back out to make sure everyone had what they needed. It didn't go over too well, and Joseph Smith ended up declaring that the Mormons weren't spiritually mature enough to live that way. Instead, it's sort of honored in spirit through tithing and volunteering. Chad seems certain that the most extreme, literal form of this commandment will be in effect in New Jerusalem. As Dr. Matthias has pointed out repeatedly, Chad is the most literal person who's ever lived. His version of the law of consecration, which, as I said, bears little to no resemblance to the LDS law of consecration. Chad's version is just communism. I know that some people feel like the law of consecration is socialism, except you rely on God instead of the government for what you need. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about communism. I minored in Russian and East European studies, and as soon as I realized that the church had entirely replaced the government in New Jerusalem, it seemed obvious what we were looking at. We'll get into it later, but I want to read this passage from chapter 4 first. This is Don talking to Emma. When the call came to move east, many wealthy saints refused to go. They knew we'd be living the law of consecration in New Jerusalem, and they didn't want to share their possessions. They'd tolerated tithing, but most of them had refused to follow the prophet's counsel to assist the poorer saints. Instead, these supposed saints stayed tucked away in their mansions and drove their fancy cars and lived the high life. As you know, there's no longer any electrical service or gasoline in this city, so I hope they're enjoying themselves. Do you hear the vitriol in Don's voice? This is Emma's father talking about it. Most of the saints eventually left for New Jerusalem, but some of the members who'd endured the tent cities now felt the Lord was asking too much of them. They said they'd sacrificed enough. They stayed here instead, which is ironic, because the lifestyle in Zion is now 100 times better than it is here. Don Fowers said the same selfishness affected some members in Salt Lake, I said with a frown. I don't understand why. There were various reasons, Mom said. Some members stayed here because they knew the law of consecration was in effect in New Jerusalem, and they didn't want to share. They called themselves capitalists, and thought they could rebuild these cities and live well. But it's hard to do when you reject the will of the Lord and lose his support. Every single person who talks about this has some snotty little comment tacked on the end of their statement. It's hard to live well when you reject the will of the Lord. It's quite obvious that they think they're better and holier than people who wanted to keep their possessions. We know that Chad and Tammy struggled with money. We know that Chad was jealous of his brothers, who almost certainly made more than he did. We know that Chad described Lori as hot and loaded, like those were the only two things that mattered. Sometimes, when people feel insecure about something, they act like that thing doesn't matter to them. This isn't deep psychology. I think Chad was jealous and upset that he didn't earn more, and he cloaked his inability to support his family fully with a literally holier-than-thou attitude regarding money. Here, he claims that Lincoln Point became evil because all the capitalist Mormons' spoiled children turned on their parents. Eventually, their children became teenagers who drove their parents out of town. The kids then formed their own little commune, Dad said. These kids are now in their late teens and early 20s, and they've never been taught morals or religion. It's not like they were raised by demigorgons. Like, the adults must have raised them until they were old enough to drive the adults out of town. Emma's mother blames this on the horrors of war, but listen to how she characterizes evil. So it's no surprise how those kids turned out, Mom said. These kids had watched their parents kill people over food. Their consciences aren't bothered by even the most vile and wicked things, and anyone who goes near their commune has almost no defense against their enticements. They even go into the other cities to recruit people to come to their playground. They use enticements to draw people to their playground. When I think of evil, I think of a lot of words that I can't say on YouTube. Awful things, suffering, pain, loss. I don't think of a playground. I've never felt enticed by evil. Chad describes evil as being irresistible. Everyone who walks past this town ends up joining. And what I think is really interesting here is that Emma's mother is talking about evil like she's enticed. She doesn't say they draw people in by being lewd and promiscuous and giving away free liquor. She describes these things as enticements because that's how Chad sees them. He's drawn to all of these evils, as he calls them. Emma agrees to go get Justin and Heather. Thus ends chapter 13. You know, I managed to find a lot to say about this chapter where nothing happens. Mom still insisted I needed to look less attractive to succeed, so we pulled my hair back into a ponytail and put a floppy hat on my head. When we went outside, Mom smeared mud on the dress and on my cheeks. Is this really necessary? I asked. You'll thank me later, she said. I suppose Chad included not one, but two scenes about trying to make Emma less pretty, to emphasize that Emma is pretty. But mostly it just makes her mom sound kind of nuts and maybe even jealous. And how will being dirty increase Emma's chances of success? I've read the book twice, I can't figure it out. But that's not the only thing her mother wants to change. There's one other thing. Maybe you should use a different name. Justin and Heather have an Aunt Emma, and they think of her as older and heavier. So Emma comes up with a nickname. Doug had been a star athlete in high school and had earned the nickname Double D because of his initials. Well, some students thought it would be funny to start calling me ED. That somehow evolved into Eddie, and I hated it, since it sounded like a boy's name. I said in my video about an errand for Emma that I believe Chad liked Doug's nickname because it was a reference to the sizing of a certain type of undergarment. And I'm going to say that, although I have no actual proof. It is my personal belief that he chose ED as a nickname for Emma because he thought it was funny to obliquely reference a certain medical condition. If you need a hint, the D stands for dysfunction. I think that's Chad's sense of humor. Just throwing that out there. Emma and her father jump on 10 speeds and start riding to Lincoln Point in the pitch darkness, which is absolutely absurd. Her father then makes this remark. My only regret is letting Justin and Heather out of my sight. Even though you'd mentioned their disappearance in your third book, I felt if I kept a close eye on the kids, you'd never have to rescue them from Lincoln Point. So, not only did Emma tell you what was going to happen, she let you read the book she wrote about the future? But she doesn't think she'd ever mentioned the apostles that they're going to die in Jerusalem. If I were God, Emma is the last person I would let time travel. But her father is the last person I'd let watch my kids. In the past few weeks, I've seen him talking to some wild-haired kids down at the fence. I asked him to stop meeting with them, but he'd throw a tantrum and shout, "Leave me alone! You're not my dad!" So he and I have had some arguments, and I'm afraid I pushed him into doing exactly what I'd tried to stop. I'm really worried what he might attempt in an anything-goes environment. So Mark knew that this kid was going to run away to Lincoln Point, saw him talking with some kids with poorly styled hair, and he didn't put two and two together? They bike through Provo and down to Lincoln Point. Through this whole moonless night bike ride, Emma's reading signs and spotting broken windows. Then Mark tells her he has to go, and she gets all weepy, and he leaves anyway, and she rides her bike some more. Suddenly there's a moon, even though Chad wrote 2 pages earlier that there's no moon, so maybe God sent it? I don't know. He definitely sent this part. A rhythmic drum beat reached my ears, and I instinctively slowed my speed as I focused on the campfires. I felt certain I was being watched. Hide the bike. The prompting was gentle, and I nearly ignored it. But then I slowed to a stop and walked the bike to a nearby bush. I wedged it tightly between the limbs and returned to gaze at the bonfires. I was close enough to see people dancing around the flames. I'm sure they're very evil. So the Holy Spirit just straight up talks to people in Chad's books. He made one attempt in an errand for Emma at having her receive messages in a dream, but since then it keeps getting more and more literal. By the time we reach his 6th book, he's got Emma and the Holy Spirit having like full-on conversations. And then in his 8th book, Jesus starts walking into rooms. Hey, how are you? But this is the beginning of God just telling Emma things. Maybe Chad thought it was too much trouble to use a storytelling device other than straight dictation to include these things. Or maybe thoughts are how his psychic promptings appear to him. I seem to recall that Dr. Matthias had an idea about that. Go watch Hidden True Crimes podcast if you want to dig into Chad's confusion about hearing his own thoughts. Anyway, Emma shoves the bike in a bush, and it turns out there's a girl hiding in the bush. Thus ends chapter 14. The voice in the bush belongs to a 17-year-old named Tara, who takes Emma to a secret hideout where she lives with other girls she's rescued from the clutches of the Lincoln Point partiers. She asks Emma to introduce herself to the group. I somehow remembered to use my old nickname. My name is Eddie. I'm here to find 2 teenagers and take them back to Provo. The group chuckled. Eddie, people can't just leave here, Tara said. These people either brainwash you into their way of life, or they eventually sacrifice you. Tara then immediately contradicts herself. I pretended to conform, then I slipped into hiding, she said. I decided if I couldn't escape, I'd at least be on the lookout for newly arrived girls, hoping to help them avoid what I did. You mean what you didn't? I assume you were helping them avoid what you didn't avoid. Whatever. There's a deeper problem here. She can't escape, but she hides nearby? I can't figure out what Chad's imagining, even after looking at maps of the area. Here's Lincoln Point. There's no wall around this town. Supposedly there are lookouts stationed at all the roads, but A, you can avoid roads when leaving town on foot, and B, Tara just pointed out to Emma the lookouts she would have run into if Tara hadn't stopped her. So obviously they're outside of the guarded area. It never makes any sense to me. It turns out Heather is one of the girls at the hideout. Emma asks her where her brother Justin is. He tricked me into coming here, and then as soon as we got to Lincoln Point, he went straight to a big building that had evil-looking people hanging around outside. By evil people, I assume she means people with uncombed hair. Tara agrees. She says, I saw Justin and Heather come into town, and I immediately knew Heather didn't belong here. Later, we find out she was probably looking at them through a 3-foot-long telescope. But somehow, even from far enough away that she would need such a powerful telescope, she could tell that Heather didn't belong here. She saw them both, but only Heather looked like she didn't belong. Chad honestly believes you can sort the world according to face value. Emma stays at the hideout that night. The next day, Heather catches sight of Justin in the telescope. Somebody who knows more about telescopes than I do, let me know in the comments if you could actually use a 3-foot-long telescope to look at something less than a mile away. Justin's lying on the sidewalk outside of City Hall, clearly drunk, and they decide to wait until he's hungover that evening to kidnap him. Personally, I would have gone and gotten him right then, because everyone else is likely to be asleep, and the last thing he's going to want to do when he's hungover is hike back to Provo. But Chad might not know that, because he is Mormon, sort of, and it's possible he's never drunk alcohol, let alone been hungover. Although I kind of get the impression that Lori might be a wine girl, so it wouldn't surprise me to learn that they drank together. They wait until dark, when everyone's getting sloshed and burning stuff, to try to get Justin to leave with them. Instead, Emma gets captured. Thus ends chapter 15. Chapter 16 starts with Emma coming face to face with the leader of the revelers, who calls himself Mighty One. Emma and the girls call him Mo, which stands for Mighty One. You know, maybe Chad wasn't making a dirty joke earlier. Maybe he just thinks all nicknames are based on initials. I don't know. Mo is dressed in Steve Young's college football uniform, but with a loincloth instead of pants. Chad thinks this is hilarious. He thinks it's the funniest thing ever written. Emma laughs and taunts Mo through the entire first page of this chapter about it. It's really not that funny. Mo isn't amused by the taunting and has Emma thrown into an empty pool with a 40-foot-long python named Sammy the Snake. Thus ends chapter 16. I don't know much about how snakes hunt. I'm not particularly scared of snakes, but I don't want to research how they hunt because that would lead to me having to watch them hunt. However, I think Chad has very wrong ideas about how snakes hunt. I returned my attention to the snake, which had now doubled back on itself, creating an imposing barrier across the shallow end of the pool. The monster was at least 40 feet long. I quickly saw the snake's plan, which had surely succeeded dozens of times previously. Sammy wanted me to try a panicked escape across him, where he'd squeeze me like a tube of toothpaste as soon as I got within 5 feet of him. Obviously, snakes don't make plans, and this anthropomorphization is far-fetched. But what I really don't understand is exactly how the snake is going to grab her while she jumps over it. In case I haven't mentioned it before, Chad's worst scenes are his action scenes. He doesn't know how to describe things clearly, he often leaves out important information, and his characters behave in especially odd ways in these scenes. Even the snake acts weird. Wham! The snake's massive midsection smacked against my shoulder and knocked me against the wall. Whoa! If that coiled body had gone just a little higher, I'd have been lassoed and crushed. Does Chad think this is how pythons hunt? That they form like a loop in their midsection and then try to throw it over prey? That is a terrible technique. By weird coincidence, I recently spent a night in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And when I drove into town, I noticed a billboard for Clyde Peeling's Reptiland, which is a herp aquarium. I decided to go, and I had such a good time. It's a small zoo, but it's beautifully maintained, and the animals are very cool. Plus, in addition to all the reptiles and amphibians and the parakeet aviary, there's an animatronic dinosaur zoo. Before I left, I was able to speak to a Reptiland employee and confirm that no, snakes do not hunt by making loops of their bodies. The employee's exact words were, "They aren't lassos," which really cracked me up because I hadn't even said anything about lassos. Shout out to Reptiland and all of their lovely employees and all of their fantastic animals. If you were ever in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, I encourage you to take a couple of hours to go through. So instead of reading this next section, in order to help you understand how preposterous the sequence is, I'm going to perform it. Miraculously, she survives long enough that Mo decides she's pretty awesome and calls that snake off. He declares Emma his new queen. Thus ends chapter 17. "No one's ever beaten Sammy," a long-haired, shirtless guy said to me. "You're stupendously gnarly." I still can't decide if that was a compliment. Yeah, Chad still hates hippies. Mo's followers take Emma to City Hall, where they've placed a mattress surrounded by torches in the council room. It's pretty clear what Mo has in mind, and all of his followers are there to watch. Emma tries to get out of the situation by saying, "I see what you have in mind, mighty one, but is there some place I could first change out of my clothes?" Mo nodded and pointed to a side room. "Right in there," he said eagerly. I walked toward the room and calmly said, "I'll only be a few moments." The crowd hooted, and Mo grinned widely. I cringed inside, disgusted at what I'd hinted at. What did she hint at? Am I just too dumb to get this? She said she was going to take her clothes off. If there was an implication there, I did not catch it. Luckily, the room she enters has a window. I went to the window and saw that only the window's bottom portion opened. It swung into the room like a hinge and would be a tight squeeze. The plump Emma I'd seen in the photo never would have made it, but I was still skinny enough to make it through. We can all thank Chad for reminding us of the importance of staying slim when it comes to serving the Lord. God hates fatties. That's the lesson here. She crawls out the window and finds Justin nearby, laying on a picnic table after losing a fight. He doesn't want to go with her, so she grabs a knife and forces him to leave camp. It's very Christian, abducting a teenager at knife point. Thus ends chapter 18. Emma forces Justin back to Tara's hideout, but Tara informs them that there's no time to rest. "You have to leave immediately," she said. "Can't we just rest?" I asked. "I'm very tired." Tara shook her head. "We saw them take you to the snake pit, and I watched Mo through the telescope. As you battled the snake, Mo's expression changed from glee to genuine concern for you, an emotion I've never seen in him. I'm afraid he might actually like you, which isn't good. It means you must either become his queen or get as far away as possible, because he'll search everywhere for you." So Tara's new friend was battling a 40-foot python, and she had a telescope, but instead of watching the fight to see if her friend would survive, she was watching Mo drool. Kind of weird. Tara decides to leave the hideout in the care of one of the girls she rescued and heads to Provo with Emma. Unfortunately, this is the beginning of several chapters of action that make very little sense. I've tried repeatedly to give Chad the benefit of the doubt regarding the decisions Emma makes here, but I can't sort out his thinking. The hideout is located in a house on the side of West Mountain, and Lincoln Point is at the base of the mountain. They leave the hideout, but the town is full of Moe's followers who are carrying torches. Within 20 minutes, we reached a dirt road that curved upward along the hillside. We didn't want to go any higher on the barren mountain, but there were still some torchbearers coming in our direction. We seemed trapped, but then an idea came to my mind. "We've got to get to the tower," I told the other ones. "You mean the big one on top of the mountain?" Tara asked. "What good would that do?" I pointed down at the town. "See the torches? Most of them are searching the lake shore and along the foothills. I'm sure this group below us will turn back soon. I feel if we reach the tower we'll be safe, partly because we'll be able to see anyone coming." But why don't they want to go any higher on the mountain? And why do they go higher on the mountain if they don't want to? And how will being able to see people coming improve your safety if there's nowhere to go? I don't know why they can't just keep hiking through the mountains until they get over here. Maybe if I'd visited the place I would, but it isn't clear from the map, and it certainly isn't clear from the text. They hike up to the communications tower and then just sit at the base and wait to be discovered. Emma reflects on how old the teenage girls seem. She says it's because they had to grow up so quickly, but I think it's because Chad has some really warped ideas about children. Tara had mentioned she was nearly 17, and she'd already been running a women's shelter for 3 years. And at age 13, Heather seemed much more grown up than most 18-year-olds I'd known. He writes children and teens like they're adults. I think Justin is his attempt to write a realistic teenager, but instead he just flip-flops between good and evil for no reason. Once he sees his sister again, he's good again. He's a helpful team player all the way back to Provo. Go figure. They watch the sunrise, wasting more time they could have spent getting away, and chit-chat. Emma asks if anyone has any ideas about how to get back to Provo. Heather's eyes brightened. "You're taking us back to the temple? Oh, how wonderful! I never thought I'd see my grandparents again." Where did Heather think Emma was taking her? And why didn't she ask before they left? Before you leave is the only sensible time to decide where you're going. Also, what 13-year-old talks like this? Oh, how wonderful. Tara reveals that she ran away from home when she was 12 because her parents were going to move to New Jerusalem and she didn't want to go. Naturally, the one nice person Emma has encountered turns out to be LDS. She promises Tara that they'll find Tara's parents. Thus ends chapter 19. The girls go to sleep while Justin keeps watch. They really aren't feeling any urgency about escaping from the band of marauders searching the area for them. "Hey, we're in trouble," Justin said urgently. "The same guys that beat me up are climbing up the hill." "We were trapped. They'd surely discover us if we hid in the small cinder block building at the base of the tower, and we didn't dare scramble down the steep face of the mountain. We had only one way to go. Up." They're at the top of the mountain. They climbed up here. At what point did they realize they weren't going to be able to climb back down? If you want to write a scene where characters have to make unorthodox choices, that's fine, but you need to come up with somewhat convincing reasons why they can't just do the conventional thing, like climb back down a mountain they just climbed up. This reminds me of my first experience of noticing bad writing. I was like 6, maybe, and I was watching My Little Ponies, the original, because I'm an 80s girl, and the ponies were being chased, and then they got backed up against this giant tree, and there was nowhere else to go, right? The episode was a cliffhanger, and the next episode came on right afterward, which allowed just the right amount of anticipatory waiting for me at that age. But when the show started again, Megan just yelled, "Run!" And all the ponies turned around and ran past the big tree trunk. And I was disappointed. I felt cheated by this very stupid turn of events. And Chad has basically written the same scenario. There's no reason they can't go down the other side of the mountain. In fact, Tad does it in a later book. If this group hadn't stopped for catnaps and girl talk, they'd probably be down by now. Instead, they're spotted by Moe's minions. Oh, and here's another thing that I never thought it would turn out I know more about than Chad Daybell. Communications towers. I know almost nothing about them. But I know they aren't made of wood. I hastily climbed the ladder and was soon alongside a wooden platform at the tower's highest level. Getting onto the platform would require letting go of the ladder, which seemed risky as a powerful gust of wind rocked the tower. Who designed this tower? Why not just construct it out of gingerbread and frosting? There's no safe way to climb onto the platform because the ladder doesn't go high enough. There's no railing on the platform. It's made of wood, and there's a 2-inch wide gap in the boards that make up the surface of the platform, which we know because Justin keeps peeping through them to report on the situation below. Naturally, Moe's guys saw them climb the tower. They start shooting at them with slingshots, and then one guy, whom Chad nicknames Maggot Head, climbs the tower. He makes it almost to the top when, swoosh! A monstrous burst of wind rattled the tower, and Maggot Head took the brunt of it. He was gone. We could barely hear his screams over the wind. Justin peered again through the gap in the platform. The whole group's moving to the other side of the tower, he reported. I don't see the guy. Then he recoiled. Oh, there he is. What a mess. Of course, we all had to take a look. Why? I actually found this really disturbing. First, Justin's unfathomably blasé comment. What a mess. There isn't even an exclamation point at the end of that sentence. A human life isn't worth an exclamation point to these people. But even worse is how Chad takes it for granted that everybody would want to look at this poor man. What he really means is he would want to look. And I think it never occurred to him that some people wouldn't. I mean, Emma is the worst babysitter for letting Heather look at this. Heather is 13. She doesn't need that picture in her head. But, of course, she needed to take a look. After which this happens. That was gruesome, but I feel Heavenly Father saved us, Heather said. How about, it's too bad a man died. Heather seems more upset that she had to look than that this guy lost his life, but she literally didn't have to look. The guy's friends, the ones who are supposedly evil, took the time to cover his corpse with gravel. So Heather could have climbed down from the tower and walked past without ever having seen anything. The bad reasoning continues. It was barely noon, and I didn't feel safe leaving the tower yet. We agreed to wait until dark, and we tried to make ourselves comfortable on the platform. They're going to wait until after dark to climb down the enormous ladder. Thus ends chapter 20. By afternoon, the unceasing wind was getting on our nerves. I need a drink, Heather moaned. I'm feeling weak. She didn't look well, and I knew it was time to move. It was harder to get off the platform than it had been to get on it. We nearly lost Tara in the process. She lost her grip as she tried to get back on the ladder, but I grabbed her shirt before she fell. Are we really supposed to believe that Emma grabbed her shirt and saved her from falling? Would have had to be a pretty tight shirt. They decide they can't go into town, so instead they're going to climb down the mountain, which they couldn't do a couple hours ago, but for some reason now can, and then they'll wade through Utah Lake to get to Provo. This is supposedly possible because the lake is so low, which, okay. Utah Lake still had the same slimy green look it has always been known for, but we didn't care as we scooped up handfuls of water. Once we'd had enough to drink, Tara asked, "What now? I don't feel safe going back to the road." And I don't feel safe drinking from brackish still waters in a post-apocalyptic landscape without antibiotics, but sometimes you have to live a little. They spend approximately the next 15 hours wading through the lake, which doesn't feel right, but I guess I can't say it's impossible. I actually tried to look into this, and I discovered a few things worth noting. First, Utah Lake sits on a fault line. Given the number of times Chad has mentioned earthquakes in this book, I feel confident that there would have been a quake that seriously altered the lake and possibly could have drained it. Plus, there's a dam that regulates the lake's level and its flow into the Jordan River, and I suspect that could easily be damaged in an earthquake, too. There were lawsuits regarding water rights in Utah Lake as early as 1900, because the lake is so shallow that in years of drought it would nearly dry up. So I'm not convinced this lake would even be there. Second, I consulted depth charts and maps of possible routes, and it is my personal opinion that the area they would have been walking on would have been dry even if the lake did still exist. Not muddy, bone dry. And it's only 6 miles across, so it shouldn't have taken them 15 hours to walk. Third, Utah Lake is heavily polluted. They used to dump raw sewage into it, and it's getting better with careful management, but it's full of toxic algae and a type of cyanobacterium that's been linked to developing ALS. So they definitely shouldn't have been chugging that lake water. At dawn, we struggled onto shore near the Provo airport. We'd gulped down enough lake water to halt our thirst, but now our stomachs were all growling. Thus ends chapter 21. After sleeping for a few hours in an old plane, they begin working their way across Provo to the temple. They reach Brigham Young University's campus, but quickly attract the attention of Moe's followers, who are still searching for them. They run into the Marriott Center, and then Chad writes, I flung open a portal door and peered into the pitch-black building. Chad once again assumes we're as intimately familiar with BYU's campus as he is and know what the Marriott Center is. I looked it up. It's a basketball arena. That would have been very helpful information for the reader to have, and Chad should have included it. But I'm more curious about this use of the word portal. As we all know, Chad believed he had created portals in his and Lori's bedroom closets that they could use to visit each other in spirit form. I looked at a lot of photos of the Marriott Center, and I googled portal doors. I can't figure out what he meant here. He uses the term portal 4 or 5 times. It seems very deliberate. If anyone knows what he's talking about, I would be interested in hearing from you. Anyway, Moe and his friends follow them into the Marriott Center. Emma and company are hiding under a row of seats at the very top, and they try to sneak out while everyone else is engaged on the floor, but of course they're spotted, and they take off running toward the temple. Thus ends chapter 22. They dash onto the campus of the Missionary Training Center, which is where Chad prepared to be a missionary in New Jersey. He writes, I could sense people watching us from the buildings, and I didn't dare venture inside any of them. I finally took a gamble and entered a building with a long hallway. These 2 sentences are in complete contradiction to each other. Either Emma doesn't dare venture inside, or she thinks it's worth taking a gamble. It can't be both. If you're going to write a character who changes their mind, always explain why. Otherwise, it just looks like your character is stumbling around with no purpose and no idea what they're doing. One of Moe's guys knocks Tara unconscious, and Emma stays with her while Justin and Heather run the last however far to the temple to tell them they need help. Emma exchanges some quips with Moe, pointing out that none of his followers are allowed to be over 25, but he's at least 30, which his followers apparently haven't noticed. Emma probably should have learned from her earlier encounters with Moe that he doesn't respond well to being mocked. But she hasn't learned, and he declares that he's going to kill her. Then her father shows up with a rifle just in time and scares everyone off. Thus ends chapter 23. They get everyone safe behind the temple's electric fence. Tara wakes up and will probably be okay. Emma's father then pulls her aside and introduces a really interesting plot idea. Then Dad motioned for me to follow him. We entered a side room and he closed the door. Things are getting really interesting around here, he said with a grin. I think you'll now understand why I didn't let you read your book. I was confused. What do you mean? Haven't we followed what my book said? Dad shook his head. Tara isn't mentioned anywhere in your book. You had written that you'd faced the Mighty One and escaped the snake. You'd later found Heather cowering alongside the road after she'd tried to find Justin herself, and then the two of you had tricked Justin into following you back to Provo. Yes, that's a bit different than what actually happened. But here's the most interesting part, Dad said. When the Mighty One's followers chased you across Provo, the two kids made it back safely, but one of the warriors hit you in the head with a rock just as you entered the temple compound. You disappeared and returned to the time you belonged in. Whoa, so I'm overdue? Possibly, but maybe you were actually meant to stay longer. Okay, finally, something interesting happens, and I'm here for it. Let's play with time travel, heck yeah! Only it's never mentioned again after this chapter. Chad does attempt some sort of explanation. He handed me the book, which was titled Escape to Provo. I carefully read the book late into the night, and just as I was dozing off, a seemingly small event jumped out at me. The storyline was exactly the same until the moment when I decided to stash my bike in the bushes near Lincoln Point. In the original book, I had ignored the prompting to hide my bike and had kept riding ahead. The gang along the road had tied me up and taken me to Mo. Therefore, I'd never met Tara. I was amazed at the changes that had come from heeding the one small prompting. I happily put the book down and sighed in relief, knowing I'd made the right decision. But that doesn't actually explain why things turned out differently. Why didn't Emma listen to the prompting before? There's never a point in this entire series when Emma hears a prompting and ignores it, so we have no evidence she would do such a thing. I guess Chad thought this was a cool idea he could use to reinforce the importance of obeying God, but he didn't think it through, so it fails as both a plot point and a spiritual lesson. Also, Escape to Provo is one of the most miserable titles I've ever heard, and I'm not good at titles. Mo is still obsessed with Emma, and he and his followers surround the temple. Emma goes out to talk to him through the fence. Eddie, if you come back, my followers will leave this place alone, Mo said. You and I can live together forever in Lincoln Point. I couldn't help admiring his relentless confidence. He sincerely expected me to consider his offer. I'm flattered you want me as your queen, but I'm not going anywhere. This is gross. Does Chad really think that Mo's behavior would cause Emma to admire his confidence? That she's flattered? Ugh, is this what people who stalk others tell themselves? Everyone in the temple has a meeting to decide what to do, because Mo has sworn to starve them out. Emma's father has an idea. I'd forgotten about it, but 2 months ago a man drove a car to the temple gates. He introduced himself as a follower of Christ and said he had a delivery for me. He seemed honest, so we let him in. He pulled the car around to the temple's south side and backed it down the service entrance ramp. For a fleeting moment, I feared I'd let in a car bomber, but when we caught up with the man, he was already covering the car with a plastic tarp. He just left it here? I asked. Yep. He tossed me the keys and told me the tank was full, with 4 full gas cans in the trunk, Dad said. The man said I'd know when to use the car. Then he somehow slipped away before I could talk with him. So, God sent an angel to deliver a car to the temple. Because no one ever has to figure out what to do in these stories. God just fixes things for the characters. And I'll tell you why that bothers me. First of all, this rarely, if ever, happens in real life. Whether you believe in God or not, solutions don't often just drop into our laps. So having that happen repeatedly makes the story feel less realistic with each repetition. But from a writing point of view, it diminishes the tension in the story. Whatever goes wrong, we know God will magically fix it. Nothing bad will ever happen to any of the good characters, so there are no consequences and no stakes. Everyone's just going through the motions. They pack up the car with food and water, and Emma gets in with Justin, Heather, and Tara, and they take off for New Jerusalem, driving right past Mo and his friends. Thus ends chapter 24. Emma's the only one who's ever ridden in a car before. Tara and Heather are terrified, but Justin's excited by the speed. When they stop to refuel, Justin tries to drive the car and instead crashes it in a ravine. "I've decided I don't want to go to New Jerusalem," he shouted back. "I don't know how you convinced me to leave Lincoln Point, but I want to go back. That's where all my friends are." "You consider those idiots your friends?" Tara yelled to him. "They beat you up." Maybe head trauma causes him to flip-flop between good and evil. Maybe each generation of their family gets a different supernatural head trauma condition. Justin presumably got hit in the head when Moe's crew beat him up and he turned from evil to good. Now he probably hit his head when he crashed the car and he's back to being evil. Anyway, he runs back the way they came, leaving the three girls stranded. Thus ends chapter 25. The girls pray for help, and within a few hours, God's faithful friend Mathoni appears and miraculously gets the car out of the ravine. He has blue eyes, a clean shave, and Nikes in very nice shape, so Emma just gives him the keys and lets him drive them to New Jerusalem. As they're going down the highway, she realizes he's the same man who warned her, George, and David away from danger and led them to a cave in an errand for Emma, and the same guy who woke Doug up when he was sleeping in Central Park in Doug's Dilemma. And I think it's safe to assume he's the one who left the car at the temple. Emma and the girls go to sleep and let him drive. Thus ends chapter 26. Mathoni wakes Emma up so they can talk without the girls overhearing. He explains that he's a translated being who's been assigned by Jesus to help Emma and her brother complete their time travel errands. Translated beings are people who've been physically transformed by God so that they no longer feel physical pain and are immortal. In Mathoni's case, he's also either able to teleport or just run really fast. I never figured out which. Lori Vallow Daybell believed that she was a translated being, that she no longer needed to eat very much or sleep for more than a few hours a night. I think there are also texts or emails where she discusses the effect on her cycles. "I am a translated being" is a very arrogant claim to make. Mathoni is a figure out of the Book of Mormon. He was a disciple of Jesus when Jesus visited the Americas after the resurrection. So Lori comparing herself to him is kind of incredible to me. They drive all night and reach New Jerusalem at dawn. Thus ends chapter 27. I won't bore you with Chad's descriptions of New Jerusalem. They are disappointingly brief and vague. In a nutshell, it's a city built on a perfect grid where everything is clean and beautiful. Everyone walks or takes the solar-powered buses and trains. Within 3 minutes, a sleek light rail train arrived at the station. Mathoni motioned for us to board, and we timidly climbed inside. Everything seemed to have a reverent aura, and I noticed Tara and Heather had their arms folded. I felt terribly underdressed. I felt I needed to be wearing my Sunday best. There's no such thing as a reverent aura. There could be an aura of reverence, but the aura itself cannot feel reverence. It isn't conscious and it can't experience things in that way. But even if Chad had written this correctly, why does the aura of reverence cause Tara and Heather to fold their arms? I mean, the internet is chock full of interpretations of folded arms, body language, people claim it means this or that. Nobody is saying it means reverence. I can't decide if Chad meant something other than what he wrote, or if he just can't read body language at all. Both possibilities are interesting. That's pretty much the entirety of chapter 28. There's a lot of bad writing in chapter 29. A lot of telling instead of showing. Chad is fairly competent in describing landscapes, but he has a curiously hard time with human-made structures, and he almost never describes the interiors of buildings or homes. We were eager to see this temple, but we kept getting distracted by our stunning surroundings. Every building was an architectural masterpiece, with every portion of extra space carefully landscaped with dazzling flowers. I want to hear about the architectural masterpieces. I want more details than there were flowers growing in front. I'm guessing I'm not the only person who's complained about this, because Chad sort of addresses it in his autobiography, where he explains that he writes like this because he used to write for a newspaper. The job was invigorating, and although I wasn't earning a master's degree as I had once planned, I was experiencing a hands-on crash course in writing, editing, and publishing. That's why my novels feel like an all-knowing reporter is describing the action. Some people would like me to write flowing, poetic verse with lots of adjectives and adverbs, but that's just not my style. I was trained as an editor to chop out the excess and get right to the point. Dude, can I call you dude? Your stories don't feel like an all-knowing reporter is describing the action. They feel like a man with no imagination trying to stress the impact of what his characters see instead of telling us what they see because he can't picture it. And adjectives and adverbs aren't excess, especially when avoiding them ruins any impact your story might have had. When Chad does attempt description, he often chooses flat-out incorrect words or phrases. I watched some of these white-clothed people enter into a monstrous 25-story building with a sign above the entrance that said LDS Family History Center. The word monstrous is wrong here. This building exists in a holy city. Nothing there is monstrous. The tone of the adjectives we choose need to match the mood we're trying to create, and monstrous shouldn't be associated with temple work. The bad description continues. The building didn't have windows, but was made out of a unique material that allowed us to see into the rooms. You mean glass? If you mean glass, just say glass. And he just keeps doing it. We next saw a 200-member choir singing Glory to God in the Highest in a small alcove of the building. You can't fit 200 people into a small alcove. I don't know if 200 is wrong or if small is wrong. Something's wrong here. Interestingly, his description of the temple in New Jerusalem is quite detailed. I was a bit confused by this because it's a very original vision for a building complex. The temple is actually a complex of 24 square buildings arranged in a circular pattern, covering dozens of acres. Each of these buildings alone was as large as the Provo Temple. From the inside edge of each of these buildings rose a sparkling 30-foot wide metal arch that joined in the center with the other 23 arches to create an immense dome. Immense glass panels filled the spaces between the arches, and at the pinnacle of the dome was the tall, slender spire I'd seen earlier. This spire easily reached 1,500 feet in the air. Each of the 24 compartments was magnificent in itself, but the combined effect was mind-boggling. But just a little research allowed me to discover that he took this idea from a vision recorded by Apostle Orson Pratt. Julie Rowe, in her near-death experience memoir, A Greater Tomorrow, which Chad published, also includes a description of the temple, and it's almost sentence for sentence a rip-off of Chad's description. I might do a video comparing them if anyone's interested. Emma and Tara and Heather aren't allowed to enter the temple because they don't have temple recommends. It kind of blew my mind that even in this holy city where only faithful LDS people live, you still need a recommend to enter the temple. But as I'll discuss later, Chad's vision of paradise is centered around bureaucratic order. Mathoni takes them to Tad and Emma's house in New Jerusalem and then vanishes into thin air, off on some other job for Jesus. Thus ends chapter 29. Emma and the girls knock on the door, and Emma's adult son Charles answers. He is entirely unfazed by the sight of his 22-year-old mother, as is his sister Leah. Heather, however, is pretty confused. She shook her head in disbelief. The Aunt Emma I have seen in pictures is older and heavier. There's no way she could have wrestled that snake. Tad, Emma's husband, explains that Emma vanished a week before. Tad put his arm around my waist. Your disappearance here was a shock to me. Last Wednesday around noon, you and I were rinsing some vegetables in the kitchen sink. I left the room for a moment, and when I came back, the water was still running and the vegetables were on the counter, but you were nowhere to be found. So you discovered your wife was missing and you just assumed she was time traveling and did nothing? Is there zero crime in New Jerusalem? Emma meets her other son and her grandchildren and her daughter-in-law Phyllis. I know that Chad names all his characters after people he knows, but the chance of a baby born after the year 2000 being named Phyllis is almost zero. It kind of stands out. Tad is a bishop, Charles is a farmer, and Leah is a nanny. They're all living the law of consecration, which seems to surprise Emma because she asks if it really works. Then she and Heather locate Tara's parents and take her home, and there's a happy reunion. Thus ends Chapter 30. Chapter 31 is mostly concerned with explaining how things work in New Jerusalem. Tad's job as bishop seems to revolve around allocating food and other material goods to church members. Again, there's some underlying animosity apparent here. When we first moved here, it was a very tough job, and I'm glad I wasn't a bishop then, Tad said. People had a hard time shaking off their selfishness, and some people wouldn't consecrate everything to the church. For example, one woman had brought a beautiful set of china with her from Utah. The woman told the bishop she wouldn't give it to the church, since it had been her grandmother's china. The bishop told her she could keep what she needed, but that a family down the street had arrived without any plates or utensils. He asked her to share part of the china with the new family, but instead she took the whole set into the street and smashed it rather than share it. Wow, that was a little extreme, I said. What happened to her? She went back to Utah, Tad said. I hope she's happy. The church owns everything. As I said before, I don't know how the LDS church leaders imagine the law of consecration will work in New Jerusalem, or if that's even something they think about. But Chad's idea of how it will work is straight up communism. I pondered that story for a minute as we walked. So let me get this straight. Everyone consecrates what they have to the church, then they receive back what they need. Is that right? Yes, people keep their own possessions, and we ask that they give their surplus to the Lord's kingdom. This surplus is evenly distributed, and the church members in Zion have reached the point where no one is in need. Most families have more than enough. Check out Leah's closet. She has plenty of clothes. Are there stores anymore? I asked, or does everything go through you? Tad smiled. No, I don't have to track every little item. Many people operate what could be called private enterprises, although the profits are consecrated back to the church. The church owns everything. The church determines who gets what. The church determines who is in charge. As far as I can tell, average church members have no say in any of that. No elections, no choices. People don't even get to choose their job in this society. Their church calling is their job, and the leaders determine those callings. Supposedly, their decisions are divinely inspired, so they can't make mistakes, but there's a lot of room for human error there, in my opinion. Communism usually fails. Not because it's immoral or even impractical, but because of human greed and corruption. So if everyone living in New Jerusalem is completely free of greed and corruption and has no family heirlooms they'd like to hold on to, maybe this could work. Tad and Emma visit the warehouse he runs, where one of his coworkers is so alarmed by Emma's apparent weight loss that he asks if she's ill. Then they go back home and find Charles and Leah both reading a book called The Record of the 10 Tribes. The 10 lost tribes of Israel were 10 of the original 12 tribes descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. Basically, the areas those tribes controlled were conquered, and all evidence is that the Jewish populations either assimilated or were deported. Some people believe, however, that the members of those 10 tribes left the area and journeyed to faraway lands, and that they have to be found before the second coming can take place. I'm telling you all this because in Escape to Zion, the 10 tribes have already made it to New Jerusalem. But Chad refuses to explain where they've been. First, Emma asks Leah where the 10 tribes were, and Leah tells her to just read the book, like it's unreasonable to want a straight answer. Then Emma asks Tad, and he says this: I'll just say they weren't on another planet or living under a polar ice cap, as many people had theorized. They'd been living as a group, but hidden from the eyes of the world. So when they began their journey here, it really caught everyone's attention, since they seemingly emerged out of nowhere. As they came from the north, ice literally flowed away and a natural road was cast up. What a cop-out. Don't do this to your readers. Don't say, we've solved a historical mystery people have been wondering about for thousands of years, and then refuse to give the answer. It's not cool. It won't make your readers like you. Then Tad and Emma go to bed, platonically. They both feel really weird about sharing a bed, even though they're both from parts of the timeline where they're already married. I still feel uncomfortable, I said. Oh, so do I, Tad quickly agreed. I feel as if I'm cheating on you. The Emma who usually lives here is the greatest woman I've ever known, but let's just say I haven't had a figure like yours in my bed for more than 20 years. I think I'm coveting my own wife. Gross, Chad. Emma reassures him that she still finds him attractive, despite his baldness and potbelly. You've developed into such a wonderful person. The 24-year-old husband I left in Salt Lake might have well-toned muscles and all of his hair, but he's only begun to develop his true potential. That's nice. I'm glad she didn't chub-shame him. But even though she doesn't mind that he's no longer Zac Efron, she isn't entitled to the same understanding. I'd also like to make a promise to you, I said. I'll watch my weight a little more closely. What caused it? The pregnancies? He shrugged. A little, but not really. What happened then? Tell me. He cautiously said, Don't worry about it. You're a wonderful cook, and I'd hate for you to cut back on the delicious meals you make. I eyed him carefully. You're holding something back. What is it? He gave in and said, Maybe make only a single batch of cookies at a time, instead of a big double batch that we end up eating all at once. I winced. I spent a long time trying to figure out why Emma is so obsessed with her future weight gain in this story. And I finally realized I was looking at it backwards. I had been thinking that Chad made characters unattractive in order to indicate that they were evil. But what if Chad is so shallow that he thinks becoming overweight can make you evil? What if Emma is less concerned about her waistline than her soul? That's a pretty wild theory, but I don't have a better explanation for the appalling prominence of this subplot. Thus ends Chapter 31. Chapter 32 is yet another chapter where we hear about how things are run in New Jerusalem. Emma is upset that her son Charles is a farmer, because apparently she thinks that's beneath him or something. There's also a dig at academics who are basically deemed unnecessary because this book rejects any sort of critical thinking. Then Emma complains some more about Charles's job. Thus ends Chapter 32. At this point, I really have no idea why the book is continuing. Nothing is happening. There aren't any storylines that need to be wrapped up, except for Emma's return to the present, and she seems to have just decided to live in the future. So she goes to church with her family and meets Leah's boyfriend. Leah soon arrived on the arm of a handsome young man with blonde hair and brown eyes. Mom, I'd like you to meet Greg, she said. He nervously shook my hand. Hello, Sister North. We've met before, but Leah says you don't remember me. That's true, but I can see why Leah likes you so much. I'm guessing she meant see, literally. Tad gets up in front of the congregation and explains that Emma has traveled through time. Tad then eloquently described my situation, and these wonderful people began to nod approvingly. When you've seen angels help build your temple and had the lost 10 tribes roll into town, a time travel story isn't too hard to accept. I disagree. Emma meets all the other families and reads a picture book her future self wrote. She reads the book to her granddaughter, whose name is Kiffin? Or Kiffon? It's Kiffon. I don't know how to say it. Then she asks Phyllis where her family is, and Phyllis gives a very disturbing account of how her parents and sister died in Baltimore during World War III. This section is one where it really becomes apparent that Chad believes society is on the verge of a violent breakdown that can come at any time. Phyllis says, I hid myself under an abandoned car and watched in terror as people killed each other for no reason. Naturally, the only people she could find who weren't engaged in some sort of madness were Mormons, and that's how she met David. Thus ends chapter 33. Emma wakes Tad out of a dead sleep to ask him if they still celebrate Labor Day. He tells her that all federal holidays have been abolished and that Christmas and Easter are now serious religious holidays with no commercialization and very few decorations. Later, Tad and Emma argue about how to load the dishwasher. Just thrilling stuff. A couple that Doug ministered to when he was a missionary arrives in town and Tad helps them get settled. They too have harrowing tales to tell. Anyone who went outside for very long seemed to be cut down by a strange disease, or else they'd go crazy and kill each other, Yesenia said. Finally, Tad gets a phone call that he and Emma have to be at the temple at 8 a.m. for a special meeting. She can use her older self's temple recommend. Thus ends chapter 34. Almost the entire remaining 40 pages of this book depict Emma walking through events leading up to the Second Coming. They go to the temple and they're told to get on buses and go to Adam-ondi-Ahman, which is the land where Adam and Eve lived after they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And it's about an hour from New Jerusalem, which is in Missouri, in case I didn't mention that. This meeting, which has long been prophesied, is attended by 1 million people, most of whom have been resurrected. I don't know where that's going on. And there's even a choir of angels that sing. Then an indescribable sensation passed through my body as the entire valley joined in the final verse. Chad loves these descriptors that don't actually require him to describe anything. Indescribable, out of this world, beyond description. I was reading the very gross erotic love story he wrote for Lori recently, and I realized I could have identified him as the author just from these terrible hand waves he uses instead of actual description. The meeting is also attended by Adam and Eve, Joseph and Emma Smith, Spencer W. Kimball, Abraham, Brigham Young, and Jesus himself. As I've mentioned, I'm not a Christian, but I was raised Catholic and briefly Baptist, so I'm quite familiar with Jesus, and I was pretty bummed by his arrival. The most glorious being I've ever seen appeared at Adam's side. We mortals gasped in surprise and awe, while the others in the crowd bowed in reverence before the Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. In what way was Jesus glorious? You gotta give me something, Chad. Was he glowing? Was he smiling? The thing Chad doesn't understand is that he can't just expect us to take his word for the emotional effect of the sighted Jesus. The closest we get is this, and I personally found it depressing. His voice soothed my soul. I lifted my eyes to see him, and tears rolled down my face. Every wicked act I'd ever done crossed my mind, and I lowered my head in shame. So meeting God makes you feel bad about yourself? That's terrible. Why would you worship a being that makes you feel like crap? We get some more telling without showing. He then spoke to us, and I felt my heart would burst with joy to hear his glorious words as he described the great millennial era that would soon come. No details. The millennial era refers to the 1,000 years of peace after Jesus returns, but Chad doesn't tell us anything about what this time will be like. Jesus is making a speech about how wonderful things will be, and Chad doesn't include a single line of it. The target audience for this story is Christians. They like Jesus. If Jesus has things to say, they want to hear it. But there's only one thing Chad can imagine Jesus saying, and we're about to get to it. Emma and Brigham Young catch up after the meeting, which apparently lasts 9 hours, even though Chad only spends 2 pages describing it. Then Jesus himself comes to talk to Emma. She immediately throws herself to her knees in front of him. "Oh, dear Savior," I said, "I'm not worthy to be in your presence." He smiled kindly. "You underestimate your value, my dear one. I've come to thank you for the errands you've performed in my behalf." I blushed and stared at the ground. It was nothing, really. "Someday you'll see the full extent of your good works," the Savior said. I looked at his radiant face. His blue eyes were as deep as eternity. Yeah, Chad believes that Jesus has blue eyes. I guess I should just be glad he included some kind of description. But I'm struck by the arrogance of this encounter. Out of the 1 million people at this meeting, Emma is the one Jesus wants to talk to. He acts like she's done this incredible service, but I'm not convinced she needed to go forward in time to save Heather and Justin in the first place. And if God wanted her to discover the names of her ancestors, there have to have been easier ways to do that than time travel. I think this is just Chad's wish fulfillment. The only thing Chad can imagine Jesus saying is, "Good job, Chad." Being in Jesus' presence is paradise, and the only paradise Chad knows is the joy of his own egomania. So he has Jesus give compliments. Chad wants to believe that when the second coming occurs, Jesus will be super impressed with him. I'm skeptical. Then Jesus asks Emma to go back to Provo because her parents are old and need her help. In my quest to read all of the books Chad listed as influences on his books, I read all of the Behind the Veil books. These are collections of Mormon near-death experience narratives, and I can see why they were popular enough for 4 volumes to be published. They're quick, fairly interesting little reads. Most of them have an uplifting message. A lot of them talk about how the authors no longer fear death. You know, it's nice. It reminds me a lot of Chicken Soup for the Soul. I'm going to read a paragraph from an essay called I Recognized Their Faces by Rana Lackey. This is about a woman who had horrific, very painful health problems and died after an operation, only to be informed by Jesus that she has to return to her body and her life. I tried to convince him to let me stay. I was pleading not to return to all that pain, but I was told I had more to do. As I looked at him, his love was so overwhelming, I almost couldn't stand it. It was 10 times overwhelming. It was like a wave rushing over me. I felt I would burst with his love, and I knew I couldn't refuse. Now, this isn't sophisticated writing, but it feels genuine. I believe this woman really did have this experience. She sounds like someone who underwent something so grand and so profound that she can't figure out how to describe it, so she stumbles from one metaphor to the next trying to explain its impact. I believe her. I don't believe Emma, and I don't believe Chad. Interestingly, too, she never says that this was Jesus. She just identifies a man who shows up after she floats out of her body and speaks to her. She never actually has to say he was Jesus. It's just obvious from her description. If we removed the name Jesus from this interaction Emma has with Jesus, we would have no idea who she was talking to. Thus ends chapter 35. Mathoni shows up in his blue Nissan, which, given that Mathoni always drives his car, I can only assume is one Chad actually owned at some point. He probably owned Doug's VW Bug, too. Mathoni says they have to leave right then. So Emma hugs Tad goodbye and hops in the car, and they drive at breakneck speed through the night. When she arrives back at the Provo Temple, her brother Doug is there. And so is Justin, her nephew who carjacked her and left her to die in the desert. It turns out he was going to die in the desert and finally repented for his sins. So then Mathoni showed up and saved him, and he's been a good little Mormon ever since. I just want to mention here that Emma's parents don't need her help. She doesn't help them in any way. She's only in Provo overnight. So why did Jesus tell her that they needed her help? How weird is it that Jesus basically lies in this story? Did Chad even realize what he was writing? I mean, let's think about this. A character who does nothing but flatter and lie. That doesn't sound like Jesus. That sounds like Satan. what would we call that? A Freudian mischaracterization? Doug and Emma haven't seen each other since right after Doug got back from World War II, and this is the conversation they have. Once we were all eating, I told Doug, I read your book. You're a better writer than you ever left on. I was just trying to write half as well as you, he said humbly. I really enjoyed it, I said. This is an actual scene of Chad telling Chad what a great writer he is. His ego here is mind-blowing. He's cloaked his compliments in the guise of characters, but they're both Mary Sues of Chad. Emma asks how Doug and Becky ended up together. Because at the end of Doug's book, Becky was dating Chris, the basketball player, due to peer pressure. Somehow the basketball player heard that Doug had written about him. The only way I can see this happening is if Doug published his memoir under his own name as nonfiction. And if that actually happened, then I suspect him dissing Chris was the least of what people were talking about. Chris hunted me down at school and we had a small confrontation in the Kimball Tower. I told him to get a life and he took a swing at me. I ducked and he broke his hand against the wall. Oh no, I said in horror. That probably didn't help his basketball career. You're right, Doug said. He was never the same player after that, but the injury made Becky became even more attached to him as she nursed him back to health. Yeah, that was his typo, not mine. I'm sure that Chris wasn't a lot of fun to be around. All of his hopes and dreams and everything he'd worked for years had just landed in the trash can. It sounds like what really happened here is that Becky dumped him as soon as he stopped qualifying as arm candy. It doesn't make me think nice things about her. Mathoni returns with the car all gassed up and takes Doug and Justin to New Jerusalem to be with Heather. There is so much unnecessary travel in this story. Honestly, in most of Chad's writing, people are constantly going places, and half the time they don't need to. Doug expresses zero regret about ruining this guy's chances to play for the NBA. Later, he explains, Becky discovered he wasn't much fun to be around when he wasn't the center of attention, Doug said with a roll of his eyes. Yeah, I bet he wasn't much fun to be around. Brother Newman, whom you probably don't remember, is Emma's former friend turned high priestess of sinful dancing and music. His father announces that the two apostles in Jerusalem who were using the priesthood power to control the elements to protect Israel have been killed. What's going on? I asked him. There are reports out of Jerusalem that the two apostles were killed last night, Brother Newman said. Their bodies are lying in the street. How horrible, I said. What does that mean? That the second coming is imminent, Brother Newman said hastily. How do you know that? I asked in surprise. He gave me an irritated look. The scriptures say the two apostles will rise on the third day, and then the Savior will return. It also means Angie's going to lose her soul. Brother Newman hung his head in anguish. Then a stricken look came across his face as he clutched his chest and slumped to the ground. Brother Newman! I screamed. Mom and Dad rushed to us and began performing CPR on him, while other brethren gave Brother Newman a blessing. But it was as if his spirit had slipped away and wasn't going to return. After 5 minutes, there still wasn't a pulse. Let him go, Dad finally said quietly. But then Brother Newman stirred briefly and looked my father in the eyes. Tell Angie I'm gone, he groaned. Then he departed this life. I don't know why Chad had this man die for 5 full minutes and then return like this. It's overly dramatic and completely unnecessary, and it's ridiculous to write, it was as if his spirit had slipped away and wasn't going to return, and then immediately have him return. That is just bonkers. Thus ends chapter 36. They decide to bury Brother Newman next to his wife in the local cemetery, and they're going to have the funeral the next day. So the next morning, and keep in mind, this is 1 day after the two apostles in Jerusalem have been killed, they load Brother Newman's coffin onto the train. Because apparently when they laid the track for their private train that only carries produce between temples, they decided to add a stop for the cemetery. Emma's father has located Angie Serena, and she's waiting in the cemetery, and she's pretty surprised to see how young Emma appears. "Holy Moses, look at that face," Serena said in shock. "You Mormons must have an army of plastic surgeons to keep everyone looking so young." I smiled. "Thanks for the compliment, but this face isn't the work of a plastic surgeon. I owe it all to clean living." That was the wrong thing to say. "You little know-it-all," Serena shrieked. "Even now, you still think you're better than me." She lunged at my throat, but several of the brethren pulled her off me and pinned her to the floor. Yeah, that was a snotty thing to say, Emma." She does think she's better than Angie Serena, although she immediately denies it. Angie Serena points out that Emma's the one who quit hanging out with her and wouldn't even return her phone calls. For once, Emma feels a little bit guilty about her bad behavior, but not guilty enough to apologize, only to clarify exactly why she feels she's better than Angie. I could now see I deeply hurt her. "I always liked you," I said with tears in my eyes, "but it was the sensual atmosphere I didn't like, and the type of guys you wanted to hang out with, you know?" Serena's eyes never softened. "Nice try, Emma, but your explanation is a few decades too late." I kind of don't blame Angie Serena here. Emma won't even apologize for hurting her feelings. This isn't an apology here, it's just a justification. They bury Brother Newman. Angie Serena starts doing some kind of ritual involving dancing and tossing flower petals, and then the second coming happens and Angie Serena is smote into a pile of charred ashes. Thus ends chapter 37. If you're thinking the end of the world arrived a day early, you're right. I don't know how Chad and his editor and everyone else who read this book before it went to press failed to notice, but 3 days were supposed to elapse between the death of the apostles and the second coming, and they didn't. I even looked up the time difference between Jerusalem and Provo, and I couldn't make it work. I guess Chad just can't count to 3. All the Mormons float into the sky for a few minutes while the earth is consumed by fire, and then they come back down. "We beheld a glorious new world. All things that were of a foul or evil nature had been consumed by the flames, and the beautiful things of the earth had been restored. The weeds and tall grass of the cemetery had been replaced with lush green grass that looked freshly mowed." I can't resist pointing out how very Chad it is that the purified earth has mowed grass. You can take the sexton out of the cemetery. The righteous begin rising from their graves, including Grandpa Keith and Grandma Rosalie, and Finity, although Finity's wife Mary is conspicuously absent. Maybe Chad didn't want Emma to have to explain that she'd fed Mary's dress to a snake. Thus ends chapter 38. The newly resurrected folks explain what they've been doing in paradise and spirit prison. Grandma Sheila's eyes lit up. "Remember how I always wanted to be a travel agent or a tour guide? Well, my assignment in paradise was to greet new arrivals and give them a personalized tour of the spirit world. They were fairly easy to impress since they'd just come from Earth. Each person had their own interests, so the tour was never the same. I loved every moment of it." I swear I'm not being flippant when I say I'd rather burn in hell than be a tour guide in heaven. They resurrect Doug's wife and their child Daniel, who died when he was 3. This part bothered me, but I should preface it by saying that I have been living with chronic pain for several decades. I am in no way objective when it comes to that type of suffering. I mean, I'm sitting in a lazy boy recliner at my desk because I can't sit in a desk chair for more than an hour. Even so, even acknowledging my possible prejudices in this area, I think there's something really messed up in what Chad says here. It was wonderful to see their fully restored bodies, but I had a nagging question. Becky and Daniel, you both suffered many physical problems when you were mortal, I said. Do you? My question now sounded dumb, but I asked it anyway. Do you have any regrets or have bad feelings about the suffering you endured? They both shook their heads. that was part of our mission in life, Daniel said. I'm not saying that a person can't grow personally or spiritually from suffering. But I'm saying it's not something to be dismissed. And to have Daniel, who was born with one arm, a deformed leg, poor hearing and vision, who never learned to speak, and who died at the age of 3, just shrug off the suffering he endured is offensive to me. Especially because Chad offers no explanation for why suffering had to be part of Daniel's life. What did his suffering accomplish? Anything, or is this just another case of God wants it that way? Not only did Becky and Daniel have to suffer, it's like they have to like it. Like, they aren't even allowed to feel resentful, which is a completely normal reaction. It's not healthy to stay in that feeling forever, but it's normal to feel that way sometimes. They can't even acknowledge it. The parallel here between Daniel and J.J. Vallow is really upsetting. They were both small boys who were born with health problems. I can't help wondering if Chad used Daniel, who had no anger toward God over his suffering and short life, as a mental model for JJ and a way of justifying ending JJ's life. Allegedly. The suffering saint is a very dangerous archetype. And then Becky responds, and she's even more dismissive. The only regret would have been if I'd made spiritual mistakes, Becky said. One of my sisters committed some serious sins and didn't repent. She's still in the spirit world paying for her actions. She knows she forfeited eternal life in the celestial kingdom for shallow earthly desires. So while my physical setbacks are long forgotten, my sister's spiritual setbacks still affect her. See what I'm saying? No. Talk about holier than thou. No wonder she and Emma were reportedly as close as sisters. Why is there this implication that regretting your suffering means you aren't worthy of paradise? If Becky had said, yeah, it really sucked, and I wish God had figured out a way for my life to be easier, would that really have meant that she was a terrible person? I don't know, that's just my reaction to this, but I think that the fact that people suffering means nothing to Chad, while their dress code means everything, is quite revealing. So this is one of the points where we're again reminded that everything has to be orderly. Everyone has to be busy all the time. There's no time for recreation. There's no time for enjoyment. What you need to be doing is working. And once you're dead, you're not going to rest. God's going to give you a new job, and you're going to do it all the time because you never have to sleep. We'll talk about that in the next book. But here's a quote of Grandpa talking about this. Grandpa stepped forward as Leah said that. I'm truly sorry to interrupt your reunion, but speaking of temples, we've got a lot to accomplish in a short time. Mark and Michelle, you need to return to the Provo Temple and get it fully operational. With nearly all of the temples having been closed for a few years, there's quite a backlog of righteous spirits waiting to have their work done. So schedule your workers in 3 8-hour shifts each day so the temple can operate continuously. Can they not take the afternoon of the second coming off? These people have just been resurrected. They've barely been reunited. They're already being assigned 8-hour shifts at the temple. Chad is certain, and some of this, I think, does come from LDS culture. There is a real emphasis on work and on busyness. I don't quite understand it. Maybe it's just the whole idle hands are the devil's plaything, but Chad really takes it to an extreme. I mean, this is just preposterous. And he has a real dislike for any kind of recreation, which we'll also get into later. Anyway, Grandpa then tells Emma that she has to go back to the past. He kisses her on the forehead, apparently hard enough to cause a traumatic brain injury, and she wakes up in the past. Thus ends chapter 39. Emma wakes up back in the modern-day cemetery, and Mathoni arrives in his blue Nissan to give her a lift home, where her parents and brother are. Chad takes the opportunity to again compliment his writing. Did you go into the future? Doug asked excitedly. I did, and I must congratulate you on figuring out where I was, I said. I read your book while I was there. You did a great job. Really? Doug asked. That seems weird since it won't be in stores until next week, but I'm glad you liked it. It was wonderful. She finds out that Doug is dating someone named Blair and encourages him not to give up on Becky, which prompts her father to say this. Emma, you don't realize what Becky has put Doug through. She plays mind games and seems very unsettled. A woman turning a man down for a relationship because she wants to be with someone else isn't playing mind games. It's literally the opposite of my game. It's being completely forthright. She hasn't put Doug through anything. Thus ends chapter 40. They call Tad to come over. Emma tells him she doesn't want to stay long because they need to go home and make a baby. But they stay long enough for Emma to tell them everything about the future because she just can't keep a secret. Her father starts talking about how they can use this knowledge to alter the future and avoid the worst parts. What areas do you have in mind, honey? Mom asked. For example, Emma's dangerous journey to Lincoln Point. It sounds like it could have been avoided if I just watched Justin a little better. We already know that Mark fails to do this because he told Emma when she was in the future that he thought he could keep an eye on Justin, but failed, which I would have expected Emma to have told him because she leaks like a bottomless bucket. Talk about being stuck in a time loop. Despite this, Emma also decides to change the future, so she pays a visit to Angie, who's living with her 10-month-old in a dirty apartment. Chad makes sure to let us know that Angie's gained weight. Emma says she's jealous of Angie because Angie has a baby. Anyway, you've already got a little boy and you're making it on your own, I said. I'm proud of you. Angie frowned. You have no reason to be proud of me. I've said some pretty rude things about you the past few years. I shrugged. I've probably deserved whatever you said. I haven't exactly been a good friend to you. Angie stared out the window. I guess I've blamed you for the trouble I've gotten into. But I know it was my own fault for chasing after the wrong crowd. You got married in the temple, and Brandy cleaned herself up and went to Snow College, but I got pregnant and became a single mom. I just felt like my friends thought they were better than me, and deep down I knew it was true. Hey, Chad, your prejudices are showing. This is just so judgmental towards single mothers and young mothers and chubby people and people with messy apartments. Then Emma realizes that Angie's baby is going to grow up to be Mo, the guy who tried to feed her to the giant snake. Thus ends chapter 41. Chapter 42 is really more of an epilogue than a chapter. Emma informs us that Angie is dating a returned missionary. I guess Emma's brief visit to her apartment really turned her life around. Chris, the basketball player, moves to France to play ball, and Doug moves in on Becky. Emma is pregnant. My journey into the future has given me great hope. I don't fear the natural disasters or even the wars that will certainly come. I only fear not following the Lord and his prophets. Each day I strive to become the type of person who might again meet the Savior of the world. Any sacrifice is worth being in his presence again. Two things. First, you have no reason to fear the natural disasters or wars because you already know you're going to survive them. You've seen the future. And two, you aren't going to be in Jesus' presence again, because older Emma will be MIA when Jesus returns to Earth. Unless he turns out to be your office manager or something, since I assume that even Jesus has to work a 40-hour week in this world. She continues. And the wonderful thing is that you, yes, you, will also be playing a role in this incredible journey into the future. So say hello if we cross paths, and don't forget to bring along your friends and family. We're going to have a great time. That is a terrible final sentence. Are you going to go to Disneyland too? Imagine being so uninspired by the thought of the second coming that the only description you can come up with is great time. So a few final thoughts. This book is the end of the poorly named Emma Trilogy, but it isn't the last story with these characters. Chad wrote a standalone book, although Becky actually shows up briefly. And then he wrote 5 more books about these characters. He does ditch the time travel gimmick, though. I'll discuss a couple of things Chad could have done to improve this story, but there isn't much to say because he almost would have had to start from scratch. The first thing that comes to mind, probably because it's a major issue in all of his books, is the plotting. He has no understanding of how to write a plot, how to create and manage tension, or how to craft an ending. Every single story in this trilogy should have ended 50 pages earlier than it did. I don't think Chad has ever heard of Freytag's pyramid or a 3-act structure. In the same vein, his characters never have a clear conflict that the plot incorporates around. In this one, God sends Emma back in time to save Justin and Heather, but there's no reason someone else couldn't have done that. Someone already in their time. God could have had Tara save them. So the entire purpose of the time traveling is nonsense. And there's no explanation for why Emma sticks around in the future for like 3 more months. Regardless of what we've learned about Chad, there's a lot to say about the way he equivocates good and evil with control and chaos. He believes in a strict dichotomy between these ideas. Obviously, this is connected to Chad's belief that all Mormons are good and everyone else is evil. Heaven, in Chad Daybell's world, is a smooth-running bureaucracy. We see it in the descriptions of New Jerusalem in this book, but we'll see it even more in his 4th novel, much of which takes place in paradise, or actually in spirit prison. It's a long explanation. I don't know enough about the LDS Church to say for certain, but I do think it's possible that some of these ideas come from the church. It does seem like there's a great emphasis on order and organization and putting people in positions where they can make sure everything's taken care of. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as you don't start getting obsessive about it or thinking that any kind of chaos is evil. In fact, now that I think about this, I kind of understand why Chad is so incapable of creativity. Creation is an inherently chaotic act. It's making something that's never been made before, and it's experimental and messy and may or may not produce anything worthwhile. That's the risk we take. But Chad doesn't want to take a risk. I suspect he's a very controlled and very controlling person. And I suspect this belief that evil is waiting to burst forth the moment society loosens its control is just a little reflection of Chad himself. Underneath his tidy Mormon exterior, he was always evil. He was always waiting to be set free. He couldn't avoid those enticements. And that brings me to my last point. When we incorrectly define evil, we open ourselves up to the danger of failing to identify it, especially in ourselves. Chad's definition of evil is shallow. It's tight clothing and visible cleavage. It's beer and hookups. I think he felt that because he dressed modestly and didn't drink and didn't swear, that meant he was fundamentally good and he didn't have to examine his conscience. It was like a checklist of things he had to complete in order to be considered good. And he checked them, so what else did he need to do? He allowed his poor definitions to confuse him, to blur lines until he felt comfortable stepping right over them. Human suffering is evil. Inflicting suffering on people is evil. Hurting children is evil. We have to keep our eyes on the ball in life. Chad got distracted and was too busy worrying about blue movies and facial piercings to notice that his own actions were truly evil. I think that's the most important lesson we can take from this book, that we have to look below the surface. As a reminder, please don't reach out to anyone involved in this case. Next time, I'll be discussing Chad's 4th novel, in which a teenage girl dies and goes to spirit prison, and then has to use her poltergeist powers to get her sister to convert to Mormonism so she can go to paradise. It's wacky. Until then, remember to use your words wisely. Thanks.
Go ahead.